Okay, so if you're thinking about using continuous provision in Key Stage 1 for the first time, where would you think about starting? What are your thoughts?
I think you have to read. I think you have to read and research and really think about it, so that by the time you're ready to start, you've got a really clear idea, I think, of what you want to achieve, what your vision is, and a really good understanding of what is actually meant by using continuous provision, working with continuous provision in Key Stage 1, because it is different to early years.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes it often gets confused as an extension of the same thing. So kind of
Or
replicating
doing it
early
again.
years.
Yeah.
When actually it does look different, and it should look different.
Yeah. And I think it's an understanding of also what it isn't. It isn't something to do when you've finished doing the real work type of thing. It's not a filler. It's not about keeping children entertained or occupied. Actually, it's a critical part of your teaching strategy. It's a pedagogical approach as opposed to something else that you might just add on. So I think it's recognizing the whole implications of continuous provision for everything that you do. It's a lifestyle choice.
It is. It's a choice, isn't it, about the way that you're going to teach children. And I think one of the most important things is to understand that it isn't something extra that you're trying to fit in when everybody's already overwhelmed and overloaded with stuff to do and to fit in.
Yeah, and I think lots of the questions, when we're meeting people in schools or on social media, lots of those questions do stem from that not fully understanding what it is or trying to use it as an add-on, and that's when actually things start to fall apart.
Yes.
Yeah.
And often it's a case of using it as an add-on because there's so much else that's going on in that school day. And, you really feel for schools when they are kind of in that predicament of how do we fit everything in. And when we went out to, we asked on social media, we went out to Instagram and Facebook and asked kind of what are your biggest questions around Key Stage 1 in terms of continuous provision. And one of the kind of most asked questions was around how do I create that child-led environment despite the jam-packed timetable. What would you say about that?
I try to avoid using child-led as being a phrase to describe. I tend to veer towards child-centered. So that actually, because when you say child-led, people often get the impression that the child is doing all the leading, and we might just sit back and just let them carry on with the leading. And everything we do, we can get a bit bogged down. Everything we do has to be led by children. Whereas I like to talk about being child-centered. In other words, we understand the developmental stage that children are in. We understand their interests and their needs, and all our decisions are made around that child-centeredness, which is something we talk a lot about in Early Excellence, having that child as the focus for our decision-making and our strategies. And once you start focusing on the children and their needs and what is most felt needs of those children, that really helps you to unpick your jam-packed timetable and clear it out, because you sometimes then begin to think, these children are 5 years old. Thinking about children coming into year 1, they're 5 years old. Are they able to cope with that jam-packed timetable? Are they able to learn? Or are we just teaching without them actually learning? So that's where I would start with that discussion.
Yeah,
And that's the reading, the understanding, knowing about child development, isn't it? And that being the starting point for the decisions that you're making about how you're teaching and how you expect children to learn.
Mm-hmm.
I think timetables are hard, aren't they? I think people are in a really difficult position in terms of the amount of schemes, for example, particular approaches that are expected to be followed and therefore are expected to have a slot in the timetable. And I think one of the things we do need to do is to really look at that timetable and in a sense, empty it out and then put in the essentials. Try and create as much space as we can. Push some of the things, get the phonics done straight away in the morning, get your PE done beginning, end of days, so that we're creating as much space as possible.
Yeah.
But also remembering that when you are teaching, whatever session it is, whatever subject it is, you're not expected to teach necessarily a full hour with a whole class, with you delivering to a whole class. And it's looking at, yes, this is what I want children to learn and to be able to do, but I can do that by delivering, say, 15 minutes whole class and then working with groups. And then there is space then for children to be in provision, making their own decisions. And it's looking at how we work with the schemes, the approaches that we have is really important, I think.
And that could be quite flexible as well. You don't have to have 15 minutes input for maths and then they go into continuous provision for 45 minutes and then it's 15 minutes for English. It doesn't work like that.
No.
And it would vary across the week, it would vary across the days, and it's entirely dependent on what you're teaching. And I think as well, it's about knowing that it's okay to not kind of pigeonhole things into those subject specific areas, as a lot of what we're teaching in Key Stage 1 would span across multiple subjects.
Yes.
Making those links.
Absolutely. And knowing that it's having the confidence to do that. And I think sometimes I think a lot of teachers feel that they're having to fit things into boxes a lot of the time. And it comes back to that planning approach, doesn't it? And what that looks like.
And I think that's the important thing about involving subject leaders in this discussion, so that they also understand what you're trying to achieve and you're not downplaying their subject. Actually, you want to make their subject teaching more effective so that children are actually learning those things, not just covering them. It's again that coverage debate, isn't it? But I think subject leaders are key to this being successful.
Absolutely. Okay, we had a question about mixed age classes, and that was around kind of those top tips really for making continuous provision work in a mixed age class. So I suppose that could be mixed age early years Key Stage 1, or it could be mixed age year 1, year 2. I think we're seeing more of year 1, year 2 as well. What are your kind of top tips for mixed age classes and continuous provision?
My first thing would be, and it sounds really obvious if but just see them as a class, see them as one group, rather, because I think we get, and I've taught a lot of mixed age classes, and I think it's really easy to get so overwhelmed and overcomplicate things by thinking I've got year 1s and I've got reception and I've got sometimes reception 1 and 2 and I've got to teach each of them separately and I've got to give them all exactly the same amount of time and all that kind of thing. Whereas actually, if we look at, I've got one group of children, some of whom chronologically are, and that's our starting point. And then, like, Claire just said, the links, look at where the links are, the bits that do join up, and then the bits that do need to be taught specifically. I think you've got a class, haven't you? I think avoid timetabling year 1 bits, year 2 bits, reception bits, whatever it is, but do look at them as groups. And for some of those times, the groups will be age group specific, but at other times, the groups that you need to work with will cross those boundaries. And look at them in terms of need. Again, that brings us right back to that knowledge of child development, doesn't it? And next steps and the progression that children will make. But also look at the benefits. There are huge benefits to having, half of your children who have already made their way through year 1, who understand an awful lot, who can take on an awful lot of the kind of responsibility. Role modelling works for both groups of children really, really well. And one of the things that you can look at in terms of differentiation is the greater responsibilities you might give to the older children in terms of leading, in terms of management of the environment, those kinds of things. And to look at it that way as well.
And I think avoid the the table that is there for the year one children to
or
work
the
at,
space or the
while
room.
they look wistfully at the early years children having a lovely time, but they're never allowed to go there. This happened to me once in a school, and I said, the children had just come back, the year one children, from something else they'd been doing. And I said, oh, are you going to get busy and go and play? And she went, no, we're not allowed to. We have to go and sit at that table. And my heart just broke for these children. They weren't allowed to access the provision. They had to go and sit at the working table for the year one. I think avoid that. Avoid it. Yeah.
So it's separating. Sometimes the timetable's separated, the planning is separated, the environment is separated. And I've seen that so often. And I remember in a mixed reception one, was talking to some reception children last term and said, oh, so when you're in year one, something about going into provision, and this little girl said to me, you don't play in year one, you learn. And it was that real kind of, you've had your chance in provision, and that's why you've got to make sure that whatever provision you have, yes, is absolutely right for reception, provides them with that core offer, but also extends and works for year one or year two or whoever, whichever group you've got. But also don't think I need a shelf that's just for year one, or I need an area that's just for year two that the other children are not allowed into, because that's not necessarily going to work.
No.
Although
if we come back to thinking about the children, we're not creating that, cohesion for the children, are we? We really are segregating them when we start to break them down into their ages. We're not, building that unison in the class for them to work together, to collaborate and, utilise each other's skills.
Yeah. My friend's son's going into year one in September, and I was chatting to him and I said, so what do you think it's going to be like? And he said, we're going to be doing more learning. And I went, oh, have you not? Because you've been learning huge things already. More learning. I mean, we got into a whole discussion about learning. But I think with children, they very quickly pick up this false dichotomy between play and learning. So, that's play and this is learning. And we have to avoid that at all costs so that children recognise the whole thing as being my learning experience here. Everything, my play, everything, I am learning through those things. So we have to watch our language, we have to watch our environment layout, our timetable, all of that gives those messages to children.
Absolutely. And that's the same in a single age group, isn't it? It's very easy for us to make it clear to children, and we do it without thinking, this is the bit where you learn, this is the bit where I stay as a teacher, that's the bit where you play, keep yourselves busy, but this is the bit where the real stuff happen, and only the things that happen here go into those lovely books that I take home or I show to people. And it's all
we end up giving a really clear message to the children then, don't we, about what we're valuing really.
So back to mixed age, it's that looking at your class, not separating, but targeting and making sure you're teaching appropriately, but also looking at progression. Where do the older children in that mix, what are your different expectations within the same environment for them?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so we've had some very specific questions come in on Instagram and Facebook as well. So I thought we could touch on a few of those before we kind of move on. So somebody asked, what could pupils do on arrival in the morning?
I love this one.
It's a great question, isn't it? So they said, could they go straight into continuous provision or should they go to a set task first? And they've also said they have a 10-minute window that the children can arrive in. I think this is quite typical in lots of schools, isn't it? With kind of a staggered morning start. So any kind of top tips around what you would recommend?
Well, I would say, I love this one. I love it because the first 10 minutes of them coming in, you set the tone for your day. You set the expectations. And if you are child-centred, you'd be saying, what do my children really need in those first 10 minutes? You go and watch them when they're coming in the morning. Watch them as they separate from their parents or their carers. Some of them, it's traumatic. Some of them, they're arguing and fighting out there. to go straight onto the carpet and have to write your name or do some, focused activity or whatever, completely disregards their needs. And I would say those first 10 minutes, you are child-centered. You're thinking, what do they most need at this time? I often encourage teachers to have a jobs list. So things like fill the water tray, uncover the sand, sharpen pencils. There's a whole list of things where children start to get integrated back into their classroom. It's a transitional time. So having some of those jobs available for children to actually participate in, so they take ownership of their classroom. It's about, this is my classroom. I'm going to make it ready. That also stops the teachers having to do all of that setup first thing in the morning. But it's really, really integrating them. The thing is, if you send them straight into continuous provision, and you've only got 10 minutes, what can they literally do in 10 minutes? Very little. Very, very little of value. And then you're bringing them all back. So you've got a big mess because they've gone in, tipped it all out, and then it's finished. So I think it's really about integrating them and transitioning them really well at that beginning, giving them time to talk to each other and you. I'll shut up now because I love this one.
I love that idea of a jobs list, Jude, like giving them real ownership. I think, we often think about those things in quite simple terms, like, well, actually, the plants need watering and those sorts of things, but actually really thinking about specific children as well and what they need in that moment. Like, who needs that bit of one-to-one with you? Who actually needs you to go and check on them in a very personal way? And really thinking about them as little beings, like they would when they go home at the end of the day and they get their cuddles from their family members and they go in, they kick the shoes off, they go and get a snack or whatever it is that they're doing. But actually what they're doing really is like regulating themselves into that new environment. And like you said, it's that transitional period. And some children will be so ready to hit the ground running and would probably quite like to sit down and do their spellings or whatever that might be. But most children, I would say, like you said, really need that time, don't they? And we need that time as teachers to actually get to know our children. We don't just get to know them in week 1 of the school year and then never get to know them again for the rest of the year, but actually what happened at the weekend? What did you do that was exciting? Who did you play with last night? Because actually, if we don't know what's gone on at home, then we don't know how they're going to be for the rest of the day. So I think there's, like you said, there's real value in that time, isn't there?
But also, I think that kind of morning thing, look at what we do when we get into school, or even when we started this meeting, the first thing you do, you want to chat, you want to regroup, you want to kind of re-establish those relationships. And I think we're in danger of forgetting that with children sometimes.
It's life skills.
Absolutely. Okay. Would you stop children from taking every resource from the continuous provision shelves altogether at the same time? I'm wondering if this is coming from a teacher who's had that experience of children tipping and dumping or something very similar. What are your thoughts on that?
Go on, Claire.
This comes very much down to expectations, doesn't it? We can't expect children to arrive in an environment where there's going to be, a range of new resources and not, and be expecting them to know how to use them or tidy them away effectively. So it's really crucial that we do spend that time with children in the environment, modelling not only the possibilities of learning, but also, what are we calling these resources? Where are they stored? How do we reset our environment, put the resources back? And, it's like anything when we're teaching, like, the rules and expectations within our class, our provision and resources also need that same expectation of what it's going to look like and where it's going to go. We can't just expect children to know that.
And that's an ongoing process, isn't it? It's not something that's straightforward.
No, absolutely. Yeah, we've got to keep doing it.
And it's not having it all set up pristine in September with every single resource. It's about introducing new resources as you go. You know, it might take 3 weeks at just a few things at a time that would be new to the children. Whereas if you put it all out on day one, everything is fascinating. And the first thing you want to do with it is just tip it all out and play with it and mess around with it, because that's a natural thing of exploration. It's your first stage of play. So yeah, just be a bit careful about how much you put out in September.
Yeah.
And I think
But
thinking
it's that
about when you do
introduction, isn't it?
introduce.
Yeah.
Sorry, Nova.
No, I was going to say, it's that introducing things that's so important.
Yeah.
And introducing how to use it,
Yeah.
but also how to tidy it away.
Yeah.
Because they will explore how to use those things in different contexts, but they will need to know the basic functions of the resources, where you might be able to use them. And I always think sometimes we forget the bit about tidying those things away, especially if they're a bit more complex. The kind of resources that don't necessarily just sit in one space. They might be something that's a bit more transient. But I think the general message here is around expectation, isn't it?
Yeah.
And planning for that. Like planning for what your expectations are in September, because they may be very different at the start of year one compared to the end of year two. In fact, they should be different. Your expectations should have leveled up. So I think it's about really planning that out and planning out, you know, what will I introduce to the children when, and what will my expectation be around that at this point in the year?
This sort of comes back similar to timetables, doesn't it? Because actually, if we're really over planning our timetable and they're becoming so jam-packed, actually we're not allowing for that time of introduction, teaching the children expectations. So we need to be really aware of that when we are thinking about our timetable planning too.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on then to resourcing. We've had quite a few questions around resourcing, and I've tried to kind of put them into questions that we can answer quite succinctly, because I think resourcing is a big one, isn't it? So one of the main questions we've had asked across a few of our social media channels is around how to ensure challenge and progression. So building on from early years through to Key Stage 1, how do we ensure challenge and progression through our resourcing? What do we think about that?
It's making sure that you have looked across from early years through Key Stage 1. Because if you just start with Key Stage 1 and you haven't looked at what children have used beforehand, then you're not aware of progression, or whether actually what you might be doing is giving them resources that are too young, too simple. And that in many cases, I don't know, stick or bricks I've seen in year 1, for example, whereas the construction resources they had in early years were more complex. So it's making sure that the whole team has a really good idea of progression, and then it's looking at and matching it up with the development stage of the children that you're at, but also the curriculum that you are looking towards, that those children are moving towards. And that's a really long process, I think. And I often what happens in Key Stage 1, not always, but fairly often, I think, from my experience and from working in different schools, is that we end up with what's left, or the things that we can get hold of. And our starting point is often to bring things in that our children have grown out of, or go to the charity shops, or see what early years don't use. And we end up putting things in because we think they're nice, or we think because we want children to have something. But what we're missing then, if we're not careful, is those really clear links to child development and curriculum, and actually what we want them to learn, what we want them to know how to do, to get better at doing. And that's when we need to almost put everything in, but then bring it all out again and think, right, it's that phrase that we use all the time in Early Excellence. Every single thing you put in your classroom has to earn its place. That it can't just be there because it's what we've got. It can't just be there because it looks nice, it's pretty, or it's been donated. It's the opportunities that each resource provides. And alongside that, it's that kind of less is more approach, not overwhelming children with vast quantities of things, but making sure that it's it's the right thing that you put in.
Yeah. And I think it's recognising also that some resources are open-ended, and so they can be used by any age group. So, for example, at my last school, we bought a collection of blocks for every year group up to year 6. So they were identical set of blocks, but actually what the children did with those blocks was very much dependent on their stage of development, also their curriculum and what was happening, and also how we arranged them on the shelves, and how we labelled them would look different. But the blocks were blocks. And so there are a whole range of resources that are so open-ended that are adaptable. And I think it's looking at not just challenge and progression, but continuity and progression. Those things that are continuous throughout their career in your school. The things like pencils. We want them all to use pencils in every year group, don't we? But they use it differently.
Yeah. And I think it's about being really clear on what is open-ended enough to be used across those year groups and what isn't. And I think Nova, you made a really good point about stickle bricks, because I'm sure all of us, when we go out into schools, small construction areas are kind of one of the areas that I always think is very telling of whether you've thought about progression in resourcing or not. Because more often than not, as you said before, Key Stage 1, if it's a new approach with continuous provision, end up with what's left in the cupboards, end up with kind of what nursery didn't want. And then you do end up with kind of situations where you've got provision for the sake of having provision, but what is it actually, what are the children actually getting out of that? Why is it there? Because actually Duplo in year 1 provides very, very, very minimal learning for children that are age 5 and upwards, because they will have been exploring that when they're 2 and 3, and potentially 4 as well. But actually we want to be seeing that progression with that, and actually kind of push and click is that first stage of that. But then actually what we want to be seeing in Key Stage 1 is how they're building on that, and how does that then fit in with that wider curriculum, and do your resources allow children to achieve those design and technology and science and maths objectives through your resourcing? Well, actually, if you've only got Duplo, it's going to be very difficult to address a lot of those objectives. So I think it's really about thinking what does work kind of across the piece, but have you actually got together with all of the teachers in nursery, reception, year 1 and year 2, and gone round the classrooms, starting at nursery and working through and discussing where each area builds? Because I think that's a really worthwhile thing to do.
Yeah, it's something I often recommend, taking an area such as that small construction and pulling all the kits together in a central place and saying, okay, so what does progression of each of these look like? And then replicating that in other areas of provision and saying, okay, these are the core resources that we think are going to offer that continuity. But actually, where does then the progression lie from nursery perhaps into reception, year 1 and then year 2?
And I would recommend buying the Early Excellence Guides to Continuous Provision, to be honest. I'm going to do a shameless plug here, but I carry them around with me all the time, because if you've got those documents, which has got very clear planning around linked with both what children will naturally do with the curriculum requirements, you can't fail. Look into that, and that really does then guide your resourcing. Rather than it starting from the point of what resources, think about what do we want our children to know, to do and to learn throughout these experiences. So Early Excellence Guide to Continuous Provision, really good.
Which brings us right back to that thing that we were talking about at the beginning, which is that continuous provision, developing continuous provision in Key Stage 1 isn't just an add-on. It's not somewhere for children to just go and play when they finish. Well, if you provide them with Duplo and stickle bricks and some felt tips and paper, that's what it will be. It won't support the entirety of what we want for our children. So we have to make sure that we have the right learning resources and opportunities.
It's carefully planned and carefully thought out.
Absolutely.
And I think that leads us really nicely into another question that we've had in around very specific resourcing for the maths area. So we've been asked, what are the essential resources for indoor and outdoor maths continuous provision. And I imagine we're probably going to say a lot of it comes back to knowing your children, thinking about progression. But is there anything that you feel are real staples for Key Stage 1 that perhaps builds on that early years?
I think I would say resources for it playing and inventing games. And that can be brilliant outside because it's so physical as well. You know, they're doing lots of things with big equipment as well, and it's that maths under the radar for many of our children. I don't know about the rest of you, but maths areas they're one of the areas that is talked about a lot in terms of not working particularly well. Yes. And I don't know whether that's sometimes because the children may have already had a solid hour of whole class maths. They don't want to go near a maths area again, but also that they don't quite know what to do there. Sometimes the resources don't match up with the resources that are used in the teaching session, so they don't quite know what to do. But that real focus on teaching children some of the games that you play, race to 10, you know, really simple ones, giving them the resources, and eventually, you know, you've got year 2 children who invent the most complex, amazing games with all sorts of rules and expectations. They've written the rules, they've written the instructions, they've made the counters, the tokens. And I think, I know in a couple of schools, they've kind of not had a maths area, but renamed it Game Station. And that's been a real draw for children, you know, can I play games? And we also know that many of our children aren't perhaps playing the basic board games that are actually really effective for number sense. And it's also a real opportunity for those, I think. And outdoors, it's the bean bags being thrown into hoops and the running to cones and doing star jumps and being timed and all those
games again, isn't it?
And a lot, and it works brilliantly for when adults are leading the learning, but it also, with support initially, but becomes that place where they can invent and create.
Yeah.
And they do naturally start recording as well through playing
without
games,
realising. Yeah, they do.
Yes. You don't even realise they're doing it. They just naturally start to utilise the things you've taught them.
Yeah, and big sheets of paper on the table.
Their own graphic representation.
They're doing it, definitely.
Yeah. I think something I always encourage people to do is to, if you're having a maths resourcing area, bring it right next to your teaching space. So that when you are doing your teaching, you're using those resources that are on there. That'll help you to really think about what resources are useful, because it directly links. And then when you're doing your teaching, you're using those resources, the children see it modelled, and then they know what to do with it. And then because it's by the carpet, during times when they are able to choose what they're doing, that's often a space where they'll go and reenact things or follow through and review things. So that is often quite a key one. If your maths resource area is tucked away in the corner, you'll put anything in it and it won't really make much sense. Bring it centre stage, teach from it.
Yeah, and I think also be careful that you haven't put every single bit of maths equipment in there. And remember, it's resourcing for a small group at any time. It shouldn't have great big boxes of Numicon or Unifix or whatever it is. Yeah.
And recognise the maths that's going on everywhere. So if you have a block area, recognise what that offers you in terms of 3D shapes, for example, measurements. So it's about really looking at all your provision and thinking, right, where's the maths here? What's happening in real terms? Numbering your pots, you know, with how many pencils are in there. Just a really simple way of children being able to subitize so they can spot when there's 5, not 6, to calculate there's 1 missing. Really simple but effective ways of making sure that children realise maths isn't a subject. Maths is how we make sense of our world.
I think they're really great tips, because what you often find is that when then children aren't using the area, you see teachers naturally trying to then find an activity to plan in that area so it gets used, rather than thinking about those possibilities of maths occurring through, like you say, playing games or life maths, really.
Yeah. And I think, Claire, when we did the Key Stage 1 road shows this year, one of the things that when people were looking at the environment, one of the things that so many people commented on was that they could see maths in every area. They could see maths just all over the place in a way that made perfect sense. And that's really key, like you say, Jude.
Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. And kind of moving on a little bit to curriculum coverage. Again, we've had a fair few questions around curriculum coverage, and I'm not surprised at all, because it's one of the questions I think probably all of us get asked when we're out on the road in schools as well. So the biggest one being, how do we in Key Stage 1 fit in all the demands of the curriculum when using continuous provision? And I often think this question is probably one of the hardest to answer as well, because it entirely depends on the different things that you're currently doing in school, and the demands from that perspective as well. But what are your thoughts around that? How do we go about ensuring curriculum coverage through continuous provision in Key Stage 1?
I think the first thing is recognising actually there isn't a huge amount. And what I loved on the roadshow was that A4 sheet with the year 1 on one side and the year 2 curriculum on the other side. And it's like, that's it. And yet we blow it up into this huge thing. And we think that because it's got all of these different bits, we've got to teach each one of those bits separately. And we've got to have a lesson on each of those. I think it's recognising actually it's quite limited in what it is. And what we're going to offer is above and beyond that. So that's your starting point. We're going to be offering above and beyond, but in different ways.
It's very much coming back to that pedagogical approach, isn't it? And really unpicking, okay, so where is the curriculum going to be taught here and here? How am I going to, effectively use the provision to support curriculum development? Not trying to think, well, actually, I've got to do it whole class and then I've got to have group work and then I might use the provision. It's really unpicking it all and thinking, okay, so where are those key aspects of the curriculum that can be taught through routines, for example, and really then ironing that out. And then you'll really see that you're giving lots of opportunities for the children to use and apply and consolidate the learning, rather than it being lots of, similar to what you've just said, lots of having to teach them in very small parts.
And it's coming back to your planning and those provision guides, Jude, isn't it? If your provision is really well planned, then not all, but much of your curriculum will be there for children to revisit over and over and over again, and increase and just deepen their understanding of it, because it's part of their school experience over and over again. Things are not brought out for that week's teaching, whether it's 3D shape, for example, and then put away back in a cupboard, are they? That key aspect of learning, teaching and learning, is there repeatedly over and over and over again. So we're not kind of breaking things down and putting it away and it not coming back out for another term and a half.
And I think you find that when you teach in that way through provision, if you've thought through it really, really well and you've planned for that provision very carefully, I think you find that your children will start to learn things without you having to do any direct teaching at all. And it might be then that you actually look at your medium term or long term plan and think, actually, I don't need to now teach that geography concept in that way, because actually 90% of the class have got a good understanding of that specific concept, just by accessing it from day one. And I think often we're guilty in Key Stage 1 of thinking, actually, I'm not teaching that until Spring 1, so I'm not going to put that out in that area. But actually, having those resources out all year round means that actually you can still teach it in Spring 1, but they've kind of done their own pre-learning through inquiry, figuring out how to use those resources. They'll have learned a hell of a lot of knowledge through that as well, so that when you then come to that talk concept that you're perhaps going to teach in kind of an adult directed way, you find that actually you've got a lot to go on already. They've got a lot of prior knowledge, and actually the learning that you can then add to is even deeper. And that always surprises me, and it will continue to surprise me, I think, what children are capable of when they're just presented with those resources and given time to explore them.
This comes back to knowing your children really well, doesn't it? But also giving yourself time to get to know your children really well.
And also recognizing that there's a whole range of ways of us teaching things. Somebody said to me the other day about teaching the oceans, and the names. I said, well, just name each of your groups an ocean throughout the year. So you might have 5 groups, right? Each of them, you're the Pacific group, you're the Atlantic group, right? So they hear that all year, and then when you come to do a little bit of teaching, they've got those names, they know them, and then you might say, right, tell me something, find out a fact about your ocean. So that actually we're weaving things through, because children don't learn in blocks. When a baby learns to walk, it doesn't learn, right, this is the first stage and you're going to do this bit, and then we'll leave that bit and we'll go on to the next bit. Right, now you're going to shuffle around on your butt. No, a baby learns to walk by learning to walk. It's the process of that happening over time. And I think we've got to sometimes trust our processes and our routines. Like I often establish like the weather watch team. So a couple of children first thing in the morning check the weather forecast. They have a log book that they write down what it's going to be. At the end of the day, they just simply report back. And then over time, you've got a log of the weather. Oh, that's part of the science curriculum done. But through daily routines. I think it's getting clever with our curriculum and seeing how it can be integrated.
I was just going to say that it's enjoyable and it's playful, and children want to learn in that way, rather than having to sit down and do said worksheet. We know they don't learn in that way. And I think a lot of this comes back to those characteristics of effective teaching and learning as well, and really thinking about how they run from early years and should run right the way through. But actually you'll find that if you are using the characteristics of effective teaching and learning, that you will be already starting to think about the ways that you can gain curriculum coverage in incidental learning throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the year.
Yeah. And it's those in between times, isn't it? You've got times for 2, 3, 4 minute conversation about the weather or about something geographical or something historical, and it's those things. I always think, particularly things like history and geography, because they're often confined to a term or a half term and they don't come outside that. Whereas actually, in order to develop, that understanding of how historians work, how to be geographical, it needs to be there all the time. Well, it gives you those opportunities. It's like the curriculum in action, isn't it? Provision. It's just, it's really rich and it's there all the time. But it gives you those times for the little bits of conversations, the drip feeding, that actually over time make a massive difference in terms of children's understanding.
Yeah.
Okay. So one question we've had around curriculum coverage is that it's a bit of a controversial one, I suppose, as well. It's about, would we be ensuring children are accessing all provision areas? What are your thoughts on that? I do think that's quite controversial. It crops up in a lot of our early years conversations as well. Would you be expecting children to demonstrate that they've accessed all of the different areas? I don't think so. What do you think?
I think this is one, again, where you come back to, is it about access or learning? Because actually they can access an area, can't they? And you might create some documentation to tick off that they've accessed it. But actually, what was the quality of learning happening within that area is the most important part of it.
And it's about knowing the child. Yeah, exactly. And knowing the child, and why are those children going, or that child going to one area repeatedly? Is it because that's what they're good at? That's what they love? That's their passion? Or is it maybe that there are other areas that they don't quite understand, they don't feel confident in, and we need to do something? Do they have a particular interest? That, it's different for so many different children, but I do think we can get completely tied up in, I don't know, laminated faces or names or whatever, in order to prove that children have been somewhere. But like you say, that doesn't mean that what they've done there has been valid or valuable or worthwhile at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I often see, where teachers have perhaps planned activities for the children to then tick off to say they've, attempted them or completed them. But actually, what the children often do is rush to get them done just to prove that they've been there, and then get into the meaty stuff and the learning that they want to based on their interests or all that rich knowledge that they've gained. And that's the bit we need to be capitalising on and capturing, is that part of it, not the worrying if they've actually accessed and been there and the evidence to say they have.
Yeah.
Because you run the risk then, don't you, of it becoming activity based.
Yeah.
And I think we've all seen this a lot in kind of where Key Stage 1, well, you're running a continuous provision model in Key Stage 1, but it ends up being rainbow challenges. Very controversial, I think. But it ends up being often being driven by activities rather than the intended learning.
And that's not led by a child, that's led, and I think there's a misunderstanding, isn't there, that perhaps that because you've set something up in a provision area, it's provision or it's child-led, but it isn't. That's something that we've decided, and there might be a completely valid reason, and there are times absolutely to require, expect children to do things when, if we've got a really valid reason, if we've planned it, and they might then be in a provision area. But if it's something set up on the floor, if it's something set up on a tough tray, if it's a sign there where you've written and said, today I want you to, then that's us deciding what the children, that isn't about the children deciding, and that's something completely different. And I think that message doesn't always come through, that you don't need, we're not saying, I may well be on your list, Luella, but the question I get asked is, do we need a challenge in every area? Well, no, because then there's no time for children, is there? And actually, what we're often doing is sitting there on a Sunday afternoon thinking, oh my goodness, I need a challenge for every area. Not only that, but I need a maths challenge that fits my maths for the week. I need an English challenge. And actually, it's similar to those children. Some children will do it in 2 minutes and it will be poor quality. They won't have done it, and it will have been
very limiting.
Exactly. And then you also then end up in that, perhaps, okay, well, what if I differentiate them? But then you're saying to children, this is the level you're at, you can do this colour and you do, and that's all. And then you give up half your Monday morning trying to explain them all to the children, and then they've forgotten them all. And it's, I think all of that just needs stepping back from.
Yeah. And there's a big difference, isn't there, between kind of getting children to go into every area of provision and having, whatever it is, name cards, coloured lollipop sticks, and saying they have to go into those spaces. There's a big difference between that and actually carefully curating a specific enhancement for a specific reason, or saying to children, I've taught you this really specific skill, we're all really great at it now. I would love you by the end of the week to have had a go at using that skill somewhere in our classroom. And that doesn't have to be in the woodwork area or in the painting area. It could be wherever you see fit. And you may well do that, but you might not do that every week. It's just about that careful consideration, isn't it, I think? And like you said, Nova, you run the risk of it being adult-led, and you fall into a trap of having lovely, beautiful, continuous provision that doesn't serve the purpose for child-centred learning.
Children can't choose what they're doing with those resources. And I think a lot of that as well, often there are questions about year 2 and later on and progression and things. And one of the things that is key to progression is children doing more independently, having greater responsibility for the documentation of their learning, for example. And there is a time for saying, this week I want you to produce this, do that, find out that. But that has to be right for your children, and that doesn't start at the beginning of year 1. It might gradually, tiny little bits of it, and it has to be taught. You can't suddenly say, I want you all to plan, or I want you all to do this, or it has to be part of what you're teaching as well. You're teaching children the skills they need to work independently, and that has to be planned for. And that's a key part of progression. But that's much more complex and careful than saying, right, there's a challenge in every area and put in your coloured rainbow sticks, and then there'll be an argument about who's got the I've lost my purple stick or whatever, all of those kinds of things. And then, a new child starts and you haven't got a pocket for them and they never quite get one. And it's all of that kind of, the process, the system you have kind of outweighs anything else that's happening, doesn't it?
Yeah. I think it's those systems have to be there to serve us and the needs of our children, rather than systems put in place that then we slavishly have to adhere to. And I think it's having a flexibility of approach, so that I think, as you said, Nova, it grows with the children. So as the children grow, those systems grow and develop and change. It's not set in concrete. So when people say, how many enhancements should I have? Well, I don't know. No. How many do you need?
Different work. And sometimes it's like, how many challenges? Well, it could, and I don't like calling them challenges because, there's challenge across lots, how many learning tasks, whatever you choose to call them. Some weeks it's one and it takes the children the whole week. Other weeks there might be three, and one takes 15, 20 minutes, one takes, do you know what I mean? It's that kind of, there isn't a clear-cut answer. But what I would say is, for people beginning in year one, just don't have any to begin with. Just let the children go in, make their own decisions, see what happens, talk, do all of those kinds of things, and plan that very carefully, the introduction of that.
Great. Okay, so should we move on to year two?
Yes.
Okay, so we've had some questions in specifically about year two continuous provision, and how using provision in year two differs from year one. So what are your thoughts in terms of that progress? What should that look like from, if you're a teacher that's used continuous provision in year one and now you're taking it into year two, what's different about that?
Well, it links in with what is specific to the year two curriculum for a start. I think that's often the place you'd look at and think, well, what does my curriculum demand of me? What does my art curriculum say? What does my design and technology curriculum say that's different to the year one curriculum? I think that's often a good starting discussion. Sorry, Nova, you were going to say?
No. I was going to also say that in some ways it might not look hugely different. There will be some specifics in terms of resources, and there may well be specifics in terms of the way you organise resources, group, label resources. But certainly I know a lot of people are working with 1-2, and that worry is there as well. I think a lot of the expectations come in terms of the how children use, what are the expectations associated with that, what responsibility do they have, but also there's a huge change, I think, in the length of time that children spend working on, I don't know, specific things that they're interested in. Through year two, they'll be working on a particular focus for a longer period of time in a more complex way. So it might be that they're interested in, I don't know, ships, but they're building one, they're researching one, they're doing a presentation on. So it kind of widens what they're doing. So end of year two looks very, very different from the beginning of year one, but it may well be that the environment looks pretty similar. And in a mixed age class, it's going to be the same environment, but what you're seeing from your children at the end of year two is very different. And their ability to do that with independence is much, much more as well. And I think, that kind of question that, well, how will they be ready for? And it's often, how will they be ready for year three? They will be so ready. And if as a year three teacher, you were getting those children that could manage, organise, initiate their own learning, you would be delighted. As a year six teacher, you'd be delighted. And it's that aspect, I think, that really develops.
I think it's about remembering as well that, kind of building on what you were saying then over around independence, it's about remembering that is a skill in its own right.
Absolutely.
To become independent and to be an independent learner. And actually we expect so much of our Key Stage 2 children in terms of independent learning, But when do we actually teach those skills? Well, actually, it's got to happen in early years and Key Stage 1. And actually, we know that the kind of that shift in brain development happens around age 7. So actually, Year 2 is a brilliant time to really be establishing those real independent skills to. And as you say, they will then be ready for Year 3. We won't have that worry about actually, are they going to be ready because all they've done is play? Which, how often do we hear that? But I think we've really got to think about how we start to increase that level of independence from Year 1 or from early years right through to Year 2, and what we expect at the end of Year 2. And that's got to be something that for us as teachers, we really have to think about ourselves and our role in that. And, you know, we can't just expect children to know how to be independent learners, but actually they are skills that we have to teach. And if we've got to teach them, we've got to plan for them.
But we also have to allow for them. And I think sometimes what happens is that as children get older in our primary schools, we do more for them. Rather than, and actually the most independent children, capable children are in reception, are in early years, because by the time they get, and I taught Key Stage 2 for a long time, but by the time they get to Key Stage 2, we're delivering, we're expecting, we're setting expectations, all of which we need. But actually, when their independence then becomes about them doing something without us around, rather than the real skills of independence, how to be independent, exactly like you say. It's basically, this is what I want you to do, but you're going to do it without me. And independence is much more than that. And that's when you see, don't you, we would use the example of paint. You know, early years are there helping themselves to paint, mixing powder paint, doing whatever they need. You know, Key Stage 2 children, adults are running around squeezing out every single shade of every single colour at lunchtime, ready for the children to pick up their one paintbrush and use it. And we don't look at that, do we? We expect independence, but we don't look at how we're allowing for it. And that brings us right back to things like timetables. If we've got a jam-packed timetable, and if we're following schemes and approaches that a teacher delivered, adult delivered, where's the time for a child to make a decision? When do they get to choose their own way of doing things, going back to those characteristics of effective learning? When are they saying, okay, well, I'm going to do it this way, not that way. I'm not going to use those resources. I'm going to use this way. I'm going to work on my own or with somebody else. That's, I think, is reduced.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think we have to think about those teachable moments and how we capitalise on those in order to teach those independent skills. Because I think more often than not, it is quicker to just have one way of doing it and to just do it yourself, and that is quicker. But actually setting time aside to specifically teach those things, I think, is really important. Otherwise, we do end up with those children in Year 6 who have had their hand up for 20 minutes, and when you get to them, they're asking, you know, to sharpen their pencil or take the jumper off, and and we just seem to go backwards somewhere, don't we?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. So finally then, just kind of a last top tip from you, really. If you are a brand new teacher, and we've got lots of those on our Instagram and Facebook channels, lots of new teachers moving into Key Stage 1 for the first time this year and are being asked to teach through continuous provision, or hopefully have decided they want to teach using provision because they know it's the best way forward for young children. What would kind of be your kind of one top tip for somebody who is new to Key Stage 1? Perhaps they've taught early years before, or perhaps they've taught Key Stage 2 and this is a completely new environment. What would be your kind of top tip for them? Claire, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think one, getting to know the children. You know, go into, if you are new to Year 1, for example, go into the early years and see how they are learning. You know, how are they accessing resources? What are their levels of independence? What characteristics of effective learning can you see them exhibiting? And having those conversations with their previous teacher, because then you know already the types of learners they are and how you can then support them in creating that learning environment for them to flourish in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important, isn't it? I think, to know your starting points,
Yeah,
not just
absolutely.
from a kind of learning objective perspective, but from a well-being perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nova, what kind of would be your kind of top
I
tip
think
as a kind of key
so
stage
many,
one
aren't there? I
specialist?
think mine would be to take it slowly. Don't feel that you have to rush into anything. Don't feel that you have to start topics, that you have to start evidencing, and just, as hard as it is, because we all end up in that kind of frantic trying to finish things, but try to just spend time, take it slowly, focus on very gradually following the children, seeing what they're interested in, introducing your space and your resources, and don't be in a rush to do anything, and hold on to that fact that it won't always look like the first few weeks. Children make huge amounts of progress, and they will astonish you through the year, but don't rush to do everything all at once, to introduce every system, to do that. Just breathe a bit and take time.
Yeah.
Yeah, good point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Jude, what would yours be?
I think get everybody else in the school to understand what you're doing. I think subject leaders need to know, the teachers, general classroom teachers, they need to know what you're doing and why you're doing it. And you need to negotiate a little bit of leeway for you. So a school I'm working with, I said to them, you need to do a staff meeting to explain all of this, to explain your reasoning and your why, and then tell subject leaders, you might not see this in a book, and explain. Because if you don't, people will start demanding things of you. I think you need to lay it down at the start. This is a bit of an action research project. Just call it that if you want, and document what you're doing. But buy-in, get that buy-in from everybody so that they give you a break and they stop imposing, and get your head teacher to tell everybody, if need be, right, we're allowing this year is an experimental year where we're trying new things. We're trying to do things differently. So
And
I think that would be my thing.
Doesn't it? You have to have SLT
Yeah,
support. And there has to
absolutely.
be that vision of this is where we want to end up. This
Yeah.
is what we want to see. This is what we want to see children
Yes.
doing. But fundamentally, this is why we're doing it. This is what we know about children.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
this is what we know about our children that we have in our school now. Because otherwise you will have, we'll keep picking on the maths lead, we will have the maths lead coming down and potentially expecting to see a full class maths lesson and not understanding that, yes, of course, high quality maths teaching happens. But at the same time, there's maths all over the place in every single area of provision. And they have to understand that, because otherwise that's when the pressure starts, the stress, well, I'm not getting 5 bits in a maths book every week, all of those kinds of things. It has to be the whole school team.
Yeah. And fear is one of the biggest hindrances to us ever achieving anything. And if you're afraid as a teacher of not doing it the right way or upsetting somebody, you will never really flourish. And it's about almost dealing with that fear from day one and thinking, where is that fear coming from? What am I afraid of? Yeah. Feel the fear and do it anyway.
Yeah. SLT buy-in is one of our most asked questions, actually, in our Facebook group. People are often asking, how do I get the buy-in of SLT? And I think for me, it always comes back to owning your research, doing it yourself, reading kind of Julie Fisher's work around her book around moving into Key Stage 1.
Yeah, if you've read nothing else, then read that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, read kind of as much reading as you can do, the blogs on the Early Excellence website, we've got our podcasts around Key Stage 1, as much reading as you can do so that you really understand why you're doing it, because you cannot possibly onboard your head teacher or your senior leadership team, or, as you mentioned, Jude, those subject leaders, if you don't know why. And I think it all comes back to that, doesn't it? Do you understand it, really understand it? have you got good knowledge of child development? And it's fine if you haven't. You know, I came from Key Stage 2 to early years,
me too.
and I needed to go away
Me
and
too.
learn what child
Oh, it's a
development. We
very
all
steep
did.
learning curve.
Yeah, and it is, isn't it? And it's a shock to the system. But
Yeah,
you know,
really
there's a
is.
reason we all haven't left early years and Key Stage 1, and that's because it's a fantastic place to work when you're doing it in a way that feels right for the children, and you do start to see those outcomes. But yeah, research, read, and then you've kind of got your ammunition, so to speak, to go into those conversations.
And for people that don't know, there are lots of, sorry Jude, people that don't know, a lot of those resources, blogs, podcasts, some training webinars are free via the website, aren't they? There's an awful lot that you can, audits, a couple of planning examples that you can access there. Sorry Jude.
And I would say, you know, make it your own. Don't try and be somebody else, and don't try and just copy what somebody else has done. You know, really have the courage, once you've done all that research, build up that confidence bank to say, actually, this is how we're going to do it here. And remember, you know, there are very few right and wrongs categorical. There are a few, but, you know, actually there are different ways of doing things and different ways of approaching it. And how you do it in your school may look slightly different to how they do it in the school down the road. But what is important is that you own it. You know why you do what you do, and your children are thriving. That's what we want. We want our children to thrive at the end of the day. That's what it means to be child-centred.
Absolutely. Owning your vision, I think, is really important. Having a vision in the first place.
Yeah, having one. Working out what it is first.
And that doesn't look like a tough tray.
No.
That's not a vision.
It's got to be bigger than that, hasn't it? And I think, you know, that's a really good point, Jude, is that there are some wonderful things happening on social media, and it's a great place to share tips. But we have to be really careful that we're not just kind of looking at a beautiful Instagram page and thinking that that is gold standard continuous provision in Key Stage 1, because it might be. But nobody's vetting these things, and I think we've got to be really careful. We've got to be research informed. Social media is great, but it's also kind of a place that you can become very easily led down a path of lovely looking tough trays, and it becomes a whole different ballpark. Then you've got to really strip it back. What is your vision? Is it research informed? I would definitely say head onto our website, have a look on the ideas and inspirations tab. As Nova mentioned, there are loads of free resources. We've got our Key Stage 1 blogs, training webinars, podcasts, audit tools. There is literally loads on there. And if you haven't joined any of our training courses as well, our Key Stage 1 courses, then I would really recommend it if you can, because that's a really good starting point, I think, for getting going in Key Stage 1.